Just say thank you to everyone for taking the time to come along and watch this presentation. We're hoping that you find it informative. I'm sure you will. We did the session with Hayley in early March, I think it was, in Bendigo.
Mm-hmm.
And we got a lot of information about it, so from it, I should say. This session is designed to be a starting point, so there'll be more information coming from our office about what you hear tonight. We've been doing some work in the background already, so yeah, just watch along. If you've got questions, ask them, and if you need to contact the office tomorrow and have a chat to us, that's fine too. And yeah, and thank you to Hayley for doing this for us.
No problem, thank you.
Right.
I'll get you to pop yourself on mute, Ruth, and then if I need to ask you any questions, I'll just say, hey, can you unmute again, just in case there's any background noise. But thank you, everyone. I just want to give a quick intro on me. So I am actually an agent. So I am a real estate agent, but I'm also a trainer and consultant. So I guess I'm looking at, and I'm actually a landlord. So I look at legislation from all three places. I love legislation. I find it really, really fascinating, and particularly at the moment with the upheaval that we've got with the COVID legislation and the current legislation, the new legislation coming in, it's a bit of overwhelm, but I'm hoping that I can just track through some of the main changes for you guys tonight and give you a little bit of clarity about what's coming. So let's kick off. If anyone does need to speak to me at all, you're absolutely fine. Hopefully you can all hear me okay, but if you do need to speak at all, press the Q&A area and just ask me a question. Or if you pop to the chat area as well, you can also communicate with me through that chat area. All right, so let's get going. So the new laws passed through Parliament. So I'm going to ignore the COVID legislation for this session tonight, talking about the new changes which are coming, and there's more than 130 of them. They were meant to come in on the 1st of July. So what's happened with the COVID legislation, it has pushed out the new legislation change, which will come in sometime before the 1st of January 2021. So it's pushed it out for 6 months. And that's because of all the changes that we're going through at the moment. It was just too difficult to actually bring in the new legislation as well. But the thing is, some of the parts of the legislation have snuck through with the COVID legislation. So although the whole 130 haven't come in, we have had a whole lot that have already come in. So we're running with 3 lots of legislation at the moment. The problem is that with the changes that are coming, most people think that it's very one-sided in favour of the tenants. And I personally do think that the legislation has gone too far in the tenants' favour. I don't think that the legislation is not usable. I think it will be fine. But I do think that a lot of the power from that agents and owners have had is disappearing. I'll go through some of those things with you. So the review timeline, they started the conversation back in 2015. Feels like a lifetime ago now. They did a whole lot of papers and they did a review back in 2018. They developed proposed reforms and they passed the legislation through Parliament, and that created the bill that we're going to talk about today. During that period of time as well, they opened it up for public comment, and there were more than 4,800 public comments submitted by a range of people and organisations, including real estate agents, landlords, tenants, property investors. Anyone who's affected by property could put in a public comment. I put in several submissions. So the main outcomes of the review is animals are going to be allowed to be kept in rented premises, and don't worry, I'm going to skim over that now, but I will go through that one in detail because I know it's one that a lot of owners have been concerned about. And it is something that's already in the Act. It came in on the 2nd of March this year. And there's already been cases which have gone to VCAT, so I'll let you know how they've progressed as well. Renters are going to be allowed to make prescribed modifications to rental property. We're not going to be allowed to serve a tenant a no-fault eviction, or what we call a 120-day no reason. So that's kind of our notice to vacate that we serve on a tenant when we don't have a reason. There's not a legitimate reason under the Act, such as the owner wanting to sell or the owner wanting to move into the property. It's just basically saying, hey, in 120 days, we're lucky to vacate the premises. We're losing that notice to vacate. What they're also doing is they're restricting our end of fixed term tenancy notices to the initial fixed term only. So we won't have a 120-day, and our 90-day end of fixed term will be reduced, but first term only. Which means that what a lot of owners will do is put a tenant in for 12 months. If that tenant is not a perfect tenant in that 12-month period, you'll look at probably moving the tenant on and finding another tenant. So we'll be turning our properties over a lot more regularly. The only way we will be able to get tenants out of properties when we don't want to have a tenant there anymore is the sale of property, change of use, demolition, repairs, renovations, I move in. So a 60-day notice for a reason. But we can't just say, hey, you're not really the right tenant for us, we'd like to move you on. There's going to be a non-compliance register blacklisting owners and agents who fail to meet the obligations under the Act. Again, a really interesting one. If you're a good landlord that does your maintenance and looks after the property, you'll never end up on this blacklist. I'm not concerned about it personally myself. There's going to be the early release of bonds with the consent of both parties to a tenancy agreement. There's going to be restriction of solicitation of rental bids for owners and agents yearly instead of 6-monthly rent increases, and that's already been implemented. So that was the 19th of June 2019. We can only increase rents every 12 months. Just be aware as well, during the COVID legislation at the moment, we can't increase the rents for a 6-month period. So we're not able to increase the rents until September. So rents are set at what they are. The sound is distorted. Okay, I'm trying to speak really clearly. Maybe if I move a little bit closer to my microphone. It was working fine okay before when we were chatting. Please up okay. There's going to be faster reimbursement where a tenant has paid for urgent repairs. We're going to increase the number of properties to which a statutory maximum cap of 4 weeks for bond and rent in advance applies. Enabling automatic bond repayments. Let me just see if I can change my microphone. And let's see if that... Unmute. All right. I've reset the microphone, so let's see how we go. Can you hear me okay now? Okay, all right. Where was I? Enabling automatic bond repayments, which will be available to a renter within 14 days where the parties are not in dispute over the apportionment of the bond. Requiring mandatory pre-contractual disclosure of material facts, such as an intention to sell. So if you want to put the property on the market for sale, but you also want to look for a new tenant at the same time, then you will have to disclose that to any tenant that's going to move into the property. Prohibiting misleading or deceptive conduct, inducing a person into renting a property. And we're allowed to do 5-year fixed term leases as long as we use the correct standard lease agreement. Now, personally, don't know if I'd want to lock a tenant in for a 5-year fixed term period. And as a tenant, I don't know if they're going to want to lock themselves in for a 5-year fixed term period either. What if you don't have the right tenant? What if you want to sell the property throughout the tenancy? You know, there's all these situations that change and then you're stuck with a long-term lease agreement. So you'd want to think about that before you sign a tenant up. Penalty units. So penalty units are fines which can be imposed on someone who does the wrong thing under Residential Tenancies Act. And one penalty unit is equivalent to $165.22, and that increases by 2.5% on the 1st of July each year. One of the biggest changes in Residential Tenancies Bill is a significant increase in the penalty units. And I'm going to give you an example. Say we have a property, so one of our, I guess, duty provisions is that the day it's agreed that a tenant moves into a property, the property has to be reasonably clean and vacant. At the moment, that's got 0 penalty units. So if a tenant moves into a property and the property's not vacant or it's not reasonably clean, they can go compensation at VCAT, but they can't, there's no fine imposed on that. Under the new legislation, the fine imposed on breaching that division or breaching that area would be 60 penalty units, which is just under $10,000. So we're going to have to make sure that A, properties are really clean before a tenant moves in, and B, we've got enough wiggle room between tenancies to make sure that we can get the properties ready for that new tenant and that they're going to be vacant as well. So that's an example of the changes. Landlords or agents are going to be called landlords or owners will be called residential rental providers. So RRPs, which is a mouthful. Tenants will be called renters, and a tenancy agreement will be a residential rental agreement. Some changes with urgent repairs. First of all, air conditioning will be an urgent repair to fix. Now, I don't know about Ruth and the team, but I can pretty much guarantee that when summer hits and it's 40 degrees, your air conditioning men have got about a week to 2 weeks backlog of work to get through before they can get to your particular property. But it will become an urgent repair to fix. It doesn't mean you have to put in an air conditioning unit. It just means if it has one and it doesn't work, it's an urgent repair to fix. A failure to comply with rental minimum standards, and I'll go through them a little bit later. And then failure or breakdown of safety related devices such as a smoke alarm or a pool fence. And there's a whole lot of compliance stuff coming in as well. We're going to have to get smoke alarms done every 12 months, checked and reported on. Gas and electrical safety checks every 2 years, and pool fence compliance every 4 years. So just be aware that all of those items will have to be done for your property to remain on the rental market. Also, anything that makes the property unsafe or insecure, such as a pest infestation and the presence of mould or damp caused by or related to the building structure. So disclosure. If you want to pop the property on the market for sale, you will need to disclose that to the tenant prior to them renting the property out, if this is right at the beginning of the tenancy. If a mortgagee is taking possession of a property, you have to disclose. If you're not the legal owner of a property, but you have a right to let it, and also embedded electricity networks. Now that's something that's done more in the city areas than country areas, where you have a block of flats where they can only use one energy provider for the electricity. But if you do have that as part of your property, you will need to disclose that to the tenants prior to them signing up. And any prescribed information, such as the property has known to have asbestos, if there's been a known homicide in the property for the last 5 years, and if there's been drug use or storage or manufacture in the property over the 5-year period as well. These are still waiting to be set by regulations. We are waiting for the final draft form of that. So it may change, but that's what they've given us to work with at the moment. Properties have to offer fixed amounts. So the reason I left this slide in is I just wanted to show you those penalty units. Remembering back, if I own a milk bar, I sell cigarettes to a minor, it's a 4 penalty unit fine. If I put on the property on the internet for rent and I don't put the rent as a fixed amount, so I say $3 to $3.20 a week, it's a potential of a $10,000 fine. So as agents, we have to be really sure about the rental price that we're putting on before we advertise. The other thing is we can't ask the tenant to pay more rent than what the property's advertised for. However, if the tenant comes up and says, I love this house and I really want it, can I put an extra $10 a week on the application? We can absolutely accept it. We just can't ask the tenant to pay more. Okay, so unprompted, not a problem. Damage. Damage is one that is always really grey. So we've got a whole lot of grey in the Residential Tenancies Act. One of them is reasonably clean. What is reasonably clean? I'm sure the guys will be sitting there going, because what we think is reasonably clean, what VCAT thinks and what a tenant thinks can be totally different. What's fair wear and tear? You know, some owners expect that a property after 10 years will come back like it's never been lived in. Whereas, you know, us as property managers, we understand that, you know, after 10 years, you have to replace carpets generally. The walls will need a paint, you know, there's additional works that need to be done. So we're going to get some guidelines from VCAT and Consumer Affairs Victoria about these really grey areas that we work under. And one of them is that fair wear and tear and reasonably clean, which will make our jobs potentially easier. Tenants must keep and leave rented premises reasonably clean as well. This is really good. At the moment, the legislation just says they have to keep, and when they move out, there's nothing in there. Under new legislation, it's keep and leave. And again, if we get guidelines from Consumer Affairs Victoria saying this is reasonably clean, hopefully that will help us get everything sorted at the end of the tenancy. So modifications. This has changed a lot. So under the new rental laws, renters can make certain modifications to their homes without the consent of the owner. To make other modifications, renters will need the consent of their owner. All modifications need to be reversed at the end of the rental agreement. For all other modifications, the renter must get the rental provider's permission before starting the work. The refusal has to be sound, fair and sensible. So for instance, it'd be reasonable for you to say no if it would break the owner's corporation rules or a modification that the tenant couldn't reverse. If a renter believes consent has been unreasonably refused, they can apply to VCAT to review the decision, and VCAT must hear the application within 5 days. Okay, so anyone that's been going to VCAT, particularly at the moment, even though our hearings at the moment are on the telephone, we're waiting a lot longer than 5 days to get anything heard. So we find that quite funny that they're going to act that quickly. Also, as a condition of your consent, the rental provider may require that the modification be completed by a suitably qualified person. So for example, a licensed electrician, and the tenant to pay an additional bond as well to cover the cost of the modification. With the modification, the only other part I want to put in is tenants are going to be given a list of what they can do without your consent, and that list is pretty basic. It's things like picture hooks, TV brackets, securing items of furniture to walls, changing basic things. It's nothing major, it's very small. For anything else, they have to ask permission for. So if it's on the prescribed list, they'll do it. We'll find out about it when we go and do the routine, and we'll report it back to you, obviously. But then when the tenant vacates, they do need to restore it back to original condition as well. So they can't just put up 20 picture hooks and then move out and leave up the 20 picture hooks. It has to be restored back to original condition. You have a duty to maintain the premises. This is the one I said before, that you've got to make sure that the property is vacant and reasonably clean on the day the tenant moves into the property. And this used to be the 0 penalty units, and it's going up to 60 penalty units. So we've just got to make sure we've got enough wiggle room to get properties prepared for tenancy. Minimum standards. So your property is going to have to adhere to minimum standards, and I've given a list of about 13 minimum standards in the regulations at the moment. Again, they're not set in concrete, so we don't know exactly what they're going to be, but I can give you an idea what they've said they might be. So vermin-proof bins. So this is council bins with lids. You would need to give a rubbish bin and a recycling bin. Okay, so they're the two requirements there. Has to be a functioning toilet, and it has to be in a room that is used or meant to be used as a bathroom, or a toilet in a laundry, for example. So you couldn't just have a toilet in the corner of a kitchen, which you wouldn't have anyway, and expect that that would be a minimum standard. It has to be in a room that should be used as a toilet area. Adequate hot and cold water in the kitchen, bathroom and laundry. External windows that have functioning latches to secure against external entry. Now, Consumer Affairs Victoria don't want to see window locks with keys because that can be a fire risk and people can't get out in the event of an emergency. But they do want to see that if you latch the window from the inside, you walk to the outside, you go to open it, doesn't open, that's secure. A functioning cooktop, oven, sink and food prep area. Now, depending on how many bedrooms you have in your house will depend on how many burners or hot plates you need for your particular house. So for example, if you have a house that's over 7 bedrooms, you would need a 5-burner cooktop for that house. If you had between 3 and 6 bedrooms, you need a 4-burner cooktop. If you have 2 or less bedrooms, 2 cooktops, 2 burners. So they've told us what size burners we need or what size cooktops we need for the size of the house. So if you've got a 7-bedroom house and you've got a 4-burner cooktop, you'll need to upgrade that. It's got to have functioning heater in the main living area, and these heaters will have to adhere to certain energy ratings as well. So for example, an apartment, you'll get away with having a wall panel heater, but in a house, we are going to have either a split system, a heater air conditioner, a gas heater, a wood fire heater, or a hydronic heater or ducted heating system with an outlet in the main living area. We will be given a period of time to bring properties up to that standard. So they're currently saying that the heater provision would be coming in 2023. So you'd have 3 years to prepare for an upgrade if you needed to upgrade your heating in your property. But an apartment can just have a little panel heater, that's fine. And window coverings as well. So window coverings will have to be in the living room and for any room that could potentially be used as a bedroom. So you've got to make sure that on the day it's agreed that a tenant moves in, that the property meets all those minimum standards. If it doesn't, there is a penalty unit fine of $60, close to that $10,000. And if a tenant enters into occupation of that property and it doesn't meet the minimum standard, then it becomes an urgent repair for you to fix. Okay, so minimum standards is coming. You've got to maintain the premises. We know that. We've got to do our maintenance. We've got to maintain our properties in good repair. I don't think anyone, would expect a tenant to live in something that wasn't in good repair and maintained well. There was actually a case that went to VCAT back in 2016 called Shields versus Daliopolis. And what it was a tenant lived in a property. It was revolting. That's the easiest way to explain it. From the description that was put out at VCAT, was rash infested, had water leaks, it had mould, it was not secure, it had no working smoke alarms, it was in disrepair. The tenant was living there for 5 years. The property, she was paying a low rent for it because obviously she was aware of that disrepair when she took the property. At the end of a 5-year period, she got annoyed telling the landlord to do maintenance and he wouldn't. So she took the landlord to VCAT. VCAT actually sided with the landlord, which was surprising. And they said that the tenant was aware of the disrepair when she moved in. She's on a low rent. She knew the property was old. And they said, basically, tenant, you lose, landlord, you win, matter's gone. The tenant then took that to Supreme Court, and whenever anything goes to a high court, it sets a precedence back in our Act that we can't ignore. And when it went to the Supreme Court actually overturned VCAT's decision. And it said no, regardless of the fact that the tenant was aware of a disrepair when she moved in, and that despite she was paying a low rent and the age and character of her property, she has a right to live in a property that's well maintained because it's a strict duty of the landlord to maintain. Therefore, it overturned it and the landlord actually had to pay the tenant a lot of compensation back. So this has now set a precedence back in the Act. It's been written into the Act now. So anything in your property has to be in working order. If you have an old, I own a property in Geelong. I've got a old wall unit air conditioner in the wall. It doesn't work very well, but it's there. Now, if that breaks down and my tenant says, I want that fixed, I would have to replace it. So I couldn't obviously replace it with what's there at the moment. I'd have to put a split system in, but I couldn't just take that item out of the property because it's already there. She's paying for it. You can't therefore remove it. But say that tenant moves out and it's not working. I can't say in my ad, you know, air conditioner not working, won't be replaced, because I can't contract an item out of a lease agreement. So if you have something in your property and there's a change of tenants, that's a really good time to pull that item out of the property so that you then don't have to fix it in the future if someone reports it as broken. Locks, we are going to have deadlock on all of our external doors. So just be aware, if you've just got a handle lock, you will probably have to upgrade that. I'm waiting for this to be set in concrete before I tell any landlords to go and spend hundreds of dollars upgrading their locks. They do say a deadlock means a dead latch with at least one cylinder. So just be aware that you will probably have to upgrade your locks if you don't currently have working deadlocks on your external doors. Pets. All right, this is one that everyone loves, so let's get into it. Basically, as of the 2nd of March this year, tenants are allowed to keep a pet in rented premises, either with the consent of the owner in writing, or if VCAT has given an order saying the pet's allowed to be kept there. So the tenant has to apply for a pet in a form approved by the Director of Consumer Affairs Victoria. So they have to fill out a pet application form and hand that to the agent for consideration. The owner can't unreasonably refuse consent to the pet. Now, the only way a landlord can say no to a pet is if they apply to VCAT within 14 days of receiving the application to say no. You can't just turn around to a tenant and say no. I jumped on realestate.com today just to have a look at some agents' ads, and I noticed that in one agency's writing in all of their ads, strictly no pets. You actually can't do that now because the legislation allows a tenant to have a pet. So just be aware, you can't put those in the ads and say strictly no pets, because the tenant has a right to apply for a pet. And in order for you to say no, you have to get to give you an order to say no. So the owner can obviously apply to refuse consent to the pet. They can also apply if they want to exclude a pet. So say the team go through and do a routine inspection and all of a sudden the tenant has a dog. Now, I went and did a routine the other day. When the tenants moved into the property, they were originally approved for a dog. And when I opened the door, there's a big grey cat. I'm like, oh, okay, the cat wasn't originally approved. Oh, yeah, we just got the cat. No, they've had the cat forever. You could tell the cat had been there for a very long time. So if I want to say no to that cat, I actually would have to apply to VCAT to say no to that cat, to exclude that cat from the premises. So just be aware of that. You can't just say no. So VCAT will look at things like whether it's reasonable to refuse consent for the pet, or whether the pet's allowed to stay. Now, I know 2 matters have gone to VCAT already. The outcome is the landlord's lost in both occasions. So the first occasion was a property. It was on a big block of land, older style house. The tenants wanted to get a dog. The owner said no because they didn't want to get a dog because they are allergic to dogs and they potentially will move into the property in the next few years. That went to VCAT and VCAT just said, bad luck, the property's suitable for the pet that's being brought forward. You haven't given me evidence that you're allergic or that you're moving into the property, therefore the tenant can have a dog. The other one, it's very similar. The owner didn't want the dog in her property. She didn't think it was suitable. VCAT just sided with the tenant and said, well, actually, we think the dog is suitable for that property, so you can't say no, the tenant can keep the dog. It is going to be very hard to say no to pets, unless it's like a 1-bedroom flat and it's a Great Dane, or it's a 1-bedroom flat and it's a border collie, you know, some active animal. If it's a property that is suitable for a pet that is suitable for that property, you're going to have a very hard time to get VCAT to side with you to say no. But look at the type of pet that renter proposes to keep or is keeping, the character and nature of a property, the character and nature of the fixtures and fittings. You know, you might have just done $100,000 fit out and you've got beautiful Baltic pine floorboards that cost you a fortune and they've got 2 Dobermans, you know, that might be enough to say no. Refusing consent to keep the pet is permitted under any act and any other thing that tribunal considers is relevant. If they do give you an order excluding the pet from the premises and more than 14 days passes since the order took effect and the pet is still living in the property, then you can apply for a notice to vacate, giving the tenant 28 days to move out. So there's a process we need to follow. My suggestion would be, if a tenant has got a pet that's suitable for the property, just approve it. Get a special clause typed up to give some conditions around how that pet will be treated in the property, and it could be about fumigating carpets and that sort of thing at the end of a tenancy as well. And make sure that whatever insurance company you're using, the insurance company does cover pets as well. So there's a few things that you need to look at. But it's going to be pretty much impossible to say no to pets unless they want to keep something ridiculous in your property. Entry of premises. So these rights of entry have been expanded and there's different rules around it. So basically, an owner or agent has a right to enter a property by agreement at any date and time that's been agreed on with the renter. However, this agreement cannot be made more than 7 days before the entry. Okay, so I can ring a tenant and I can say, hey, can I pop through at 12 o'clock tomorrow? And the tenant goes, yeah, no problem. That's agreement. I can do it. However, if I have to serve by notice, so if a tenant's a bit more difficult or you want to follow the exact rules of the legislation, it's going to be a minimum 7 days notice to do advertising, photos and videos, and also for valuation purposes. So if you have a property that you've put on the market, it's a private sale and you've got to sold it subject to finance, and there's a 14-day subject to finance clause, our valuers have to be aware that it could be a minimum of 7 days before we can get them through, unless we can get agreement with the tenant to let us through earlier. It's going to be a minimum of 24 hours for landlord duty, tenant failed to comply, and family violence. So they haven't changed. It will be a minimum 48 hours notice for sales and rental inspections. Okay, so minimum 48 hours for those. It will be a minimum, for, didn't put it in here, routine inspections are going to be a minimum 7 days notice as well. So when we want to go through and do a routine inspection, minimum 7 days notice. This is a good change. So I'm going to give you a few good ones and then I'm going to give you one really bad one. So grounds of entry for renting, we're going to be allowed to go through in the last 21 days of the tenancy, up to twice a week unless otherwise agreed. Currently, we can only go through in the last 14 days of the tenancy. So it gives us an extra week to try and find a tenant for your property. Access for sale or used as security for a loan. When you want to sell a property and you have a tenant in place, you will need to serve a tenant with a 14-day notice of intention to sell. So it's basically giving the tenant 14 days notice that you're about to put the property on the market for sale. You then need to make reasonable efforts to agree with days and times for inspection, up to twice a week unless otherwise agreed, for a period of no longer than 1 hour. Now, you will have to pay the tenant the prescribed compensation for each sales inspection. Now, often owners are a bit grumpy about that one. I get it. They have set the compensation currently in the regulations as half a day's rent per sales inspection. So say you have a 4-week campaign, you're going through the property twice a week, that would be 8 times half a day, so a total of 4 days rent back to the tenant. They've also set it as a minimum of $30 per inspection. So if you have a property that's less than about $400 a week, then you'll pay a minimum of $30 per inspection. For everyone over that threshold, you're paying half a day's rent. So just be aware of that one. The other option is wait till the property's vacant, sell it without a tenant. But think about this, if you sell it with a tenant in place and you have a good tenant in place, and it costs you a little bit of renter's compensation, you've still got the rest of the rent coming in, you know, so you will be ahead, because otherwise if it's vacant, you've got no rent coming in. You might as well give a little bit of compensation to have someone in there. Depreciation will be taken into account. It is taken into account now, but it's not written into legislation. And what I mean by depreciation is everything in a property has a lifespan. So carpet, for example, 8 years. So if you have a tenant who's living in a property and when they move, you've lived there for the last 20 years, the carpet's 10 years old, but it looks perfect. When you moved out, it looked like brand new. Tenant moves in, stays there 12 months, carpet's trashed. You got to rip it out. If you went to VCAT to get compensation for that carpet, you wouldn't get anything because VCAT will look at it and say, well, carpet's got an 8-year lifespan, it's 10 years old, therefore you've had the benefit of the period of time that it's been used for, it's got no value left. So just take that into account, that when we're negotiating things out, we have to take depreciation into account. Break leases will also be covered by legislation, meaning if a tenant breaks their lease before the end of their fixed term agreement or gives us less than 28 days notice, we can do a break lease. We can charge them a pro rata let fee, advertising and rent until the property is relet. So it's actually determined on what costs you pay to the agency. So for example, if you pay a 2-week let fee and the tenant's there for half that time, then you would get compensated for half that let fee because you've had the benefit of the tenant for half the time. Reduced period of notice. This is one that's actually come in early with the COVID legislation. If you serve a tenant with a notice to vacate under new legislation, going back to notices to vacate, or if they need personal or special care, if they get director of housing, if they've been offered temporary crisis accommodation, they will be able to give you 14 days return notice, irrespective of end of lease term, meaning you can't hold them to the end of the lease. So say in March, you want the tenant to move out in the end of May because you want to sell the property. You serve them a 60-day notice to vacate in March. They can give you immediately 14 days to vacate and move out before the end of March, and they've still got a lease up until May. Okay, so just be aware, as soon as you serve a notice, they can give you a 14-day notice and move out. Damage. A tenant, whether by act or omission, intentionally or recklessly causes serious damage to the property, including smoke alarms, is an immediate notice to vacate. This is a really, really interesting one, and we're going through this particularly at the moment with one of the properties on our portfolio where a tenant has been violent towards neighbours as well, which is one of my next slides. And the police have been called many times and we're trying to get him out on endangerment. Then on the weekend he went a little bit crazy and smashed the place up. And look, it's a really sad case. We actually took this one over from someone else, so we're just trying to deal with it as best we can, but we do need to get this tenant out of the property. Since we first started, I think it's been 5 and a bit weeks since we've been going through the process. So although it says it's an immediate notice to vacate, it is really hard to get tenants out on this damage and endangerment path. But they are changing the damage to no longer include the word malicious. And the way they've written it, it's intentionally or recklessly causes damage to the property. So if you have a tenant that smashes all your smoke alarms, for example, then you'll be able to serve them with an immediate notice to vacate. But immediate doesn't mean you get them out immediately. This is in now as well. So this is where the renter or their visitor by act or omission endangers the safety of neighbours, the owner, the agent, the contractor or employee. So at the moment, endangerment only covers neighbours, but they've brought in new legislation to also include the owner, agent, contractor and employee. And again, it's an immediate notice to vacate. Now, I've been pretty lucky in my career. I haven't put myself in too many situations that were dangerous. However, very early on in my career, I did have some guys try and throw me off a balcony. So this would have been one that I could have potentially used for them now. However, back in the day, 15 years ago when it happened to me, danger only actually covered occupiers of neighbouring premises. So when I wanted to deal with this situation with these tenants that tried to tip me off the balcony, I actually had to go through the police rather than the legislation. So I'm actually really glad that they're bringing in some things to help us in the future and protect us as well. Threats and intimidation, this is coming early with the COVID legislation as well. So it's going to be a 14-day notice to vacate if a tenant or someone jointly occupying the premises has seriously threatened or intimidated the owner, agent, contractor or employee. Okay, so that's a brand newie. Again, one I'm really, really happy about having in the legislation. Non-payment of rent. This is the one you're not going to like, because I don't like it either. Okay, what I will say before I go through non-payment of rent is there are very few tenants that play the renters game to this level. And I'm sure that the guys at the office will go, yeah, maybe one or two that we have serious problems with like this. There won't be a lot though. So don't think every tenant's going to take advantage. 99% of tenants are actually really good. But for the ones that aren't good, they are going to have more leeway to be bad. So owners will be able to issue a notice to vacate when the rent is 14 days or more in arrears. VCAT will now be able to disallow the vacate notice if all of the rent is paid on or before the termination date during a 12-month period. If a rent has received 4 strikes in a 12-month period, they will accrue 4 strikes. If no more notices are required in the 12 months, then the strikes will be wiped. And owners can apply for compensation for any amount of unpaid rent and other losses if the rent is at least 14 days late on 2 previous occasions. So what this means is when a tenant is 14 days late, up until the point of them being 14 days late, we can ring, we can email, we can, beg for them to pay rent, but we can't do anything officially. Once they're 15 days late, we serve what's called a 14-day notice to vacate. That gives them another 14 days to either pay the rent or move out. That's what you've asked for. They're going to be allowed to have 4 of those every 12 months, and it will reset every 12-month period. It's only on the 5th occasion of a non-payment of rent that we will be allowed to go to VCAT to seek a termination order to get them out. So if a tenant, is in arrears, 14 days, 15th day you serve a notice, they pay nothing, we can get to VCAT. But if they use that extra period to pay the rent, then it's just 1 strike. So no one likes it. It's not great. It does give tenants a lot more leeway to pay their rent late. This is one that I left in just to show you how significant the penalty units can be. So often an owner will say, I know how to get a tenant out. I'll serve them with a 60-day notice to say I'm going to move in. And then when they move out and hand me the key, I'll give it back to you and you can put on the rental market. We'll find another tenant. Don't do that. So basically, if you serve a notice to vacate on a tenant, you will need to follow through with that notice or leave the property vacant from 6 months from then when the notice to vacate was given. So if you've got a 60-day notice, your tenants can be there for that 60-day period. You then just keep vacant for 3 and a bit more months, and then you can put a new tenant in. The other option is to go to VCAT. But what I would say to you is make sure that if you are serving a notice to vacate, you intend to follow through with the reason, because you don't want to be brought before VCAT with the potential of a fine like this, and your property managers won't let you get in trouble anyway. So what we can do now and in the future, we're going to have really good stringent tenancy checks with an increased focus on their ability to pay rent, and that's even more important now with this COVID legislation. Landlords have to have insurance to further protect themselves. So as a landlord, I own investment properties. I have insurance for my investment properties. Just make sure you have landlords cover as well as building cover. Make sure that you have as much protection as possible moving forward. I wouldn't want to have a property that wasn't fully insured moving forward. We've started to look at doing longer term leases of say 15 months to ensure we can conduct our 2 routines and decide whether we want to keep them or not, because we want to have a bit longer trial period. We want to make sure that that tenant's the right tenant for the property. If they're not, we're going to be encouraging you to serve a notice to vacate, to move a tenant on, so that we can then get another tenant who is more suitable for your property. So just expect a bigger turnover of tenants. Have practices that allow timely dealings with bonds, because the tenant will have a right to apply for their bond back with the bond authority, and we actually have to action it a lot quicker than we do now. We will need to be prepared to go to VCAT more often and have longer wait times for hearings. That's a given. Unfortunately, that's the way it's going to be. And it is changing. We do need to get on board and accept it. And these guys have done all of my training already, which is fantastic. And we have been given a lifeline where we've been given another, 6 months to basically get on top of all the COVID changes before this legislation will come. But I know that, the guys here are already starting to prepare their office for the changes. So hopefully I haven't made you all too sad. Hopefully you're sort of okay with it. What I will say is, for the most part, it's going to be business as usual for us. We just want all of our clients, I guess, to be aware that things are changing. So if we come to you and we say, hey, this is the situation here, and you go, oh, just trust that these guys have got your best interests at heart and they're going to keep you safe as possible. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. I will email Ruth my slideshow presentation as well, so more than happy to share that with everyone if people want to have a read of it later. But Ruth, did you want to unmute yourself? Yep.
It's just ducked around the corner.
Yeah, just hiding. That's fine. Did you guys have any questions at all out of today's session, or anything that's popped up that was different than last time? No. There's most of that we're aware, pretty much aware of. And your session covered. There were a couple of little wording changes I noticed, but we were familiar with most of that. Excellent. If anyone's got any questions now, happy to answer them either in the chat area or the Q&A section. And even if it's about COVID, I'm happy to sort of answer any of those sort of tricky ones as well. And if there's anything that you guys want me to cover, I'm happy to do it. I feel like I've been talking non-stop. So. Did the sound get better? Yes. Good. I think it's because we are on NBN, but I do live in the country, so it gets a bit dodgy when everyone's sitting at home watching Netflix. And I think it's when I start recording, it has a big download, and it just takes a couple of minutes to settle itself down. So, gotcha. Apologies for that one. Bit the same here. Yeah, no questions coming through, so we must have answered everything. Like I said before, if anyone wants to give us a call tomorrow or whatever and speak to us about any questions they might have, that's fine as well. If you want to go through the content that Hayley's going to provide and then come back to us with questions, that's fine. Yeah, no problem. And what I'll do, once the recording's all done, I'll shoot it off to Ruth as well. So if you want to watch it back, you'll be able to send links out for that. So it's there for anyone. And that's it. So I can go and relax by the TV and use up the internet for other people now. Thank you very much, Hayley. Very much appreciate you taking time out of your night. No problem at all. Oh, look, we've had something pop up now. There we go. Oh, Nick said thank you very much. Julia said thank you, so that's great. No problem. All right. Well, I will log off now. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. I'm sure I'll see you again once this whole COVID thing's over and we can actually get face-to-face. But until then, it's nice to see you online anyway. Lovely. Thanks, Hayley. Thanks. Bye. Bye. Oh, can I see? Oh, thank you.